Each year in May, we update Americans' views of the moral acceptability, and those are the words we use, morally acceptable, of a long series of different behaviors or actions that people could take. We've just updated them again in May, and the full results are here on Gallup.com, but I thought I would highlight a few of the interesting facts that we find when we look at the data. Now, there's a huge range in the 19 issues that we tested. It goes all the way from over 90% who say that birth control is morally acceptable, all the way down to a lonely 6% who say that an affair, married men and women having an affair, is morally acceptable. So that's a huge range there. Interestingly, out of the 19 issues that we rated, 7 of them are seen as morally unacceptable by a majority of Americans, just 7 out of the 19, and I think it's worth it to look at those in a little more detail. 2 of these had to do with cloning animals, cloning humans. The majority of Americans say that's morally unacceptable. 1 of them has to do with suicide, which is seen as morally unacceptable by a majority. And the remaining 4 out of these 7 have to do with sexual relations, which is interesting. Of course, when we think about morality, a lot of times we do think about the ways that sexual relations are handled normatively in a society. What are the 4 that have to do with sexual relations? Well, teenagers having sex. A majority of Americans say that's not morally acceptable. A married man and a married woman having an affair, as mentioned, that's seen as morally unacceptable by a majority of Americans. Pornography, morally unacceptable, and polygamy is also seen as morally unacceptable by a majority of Americans. We asked this time about one issue which is quite interesting, and that is having a baby out of wedlock, as it has been said previously. The reason that's interesting is the Census Bureau tells us that's happening increasingly. More and more women are having babies when they're not married, but this time we asked about it in 2 different ways, worded it differently, and I think the results are quite interesting. The trend, the way that we've asked it over the years, is having a baby outside of marriage, and when we ask it that way this year, 60% of Americans say that is acceptable. The other way that we asked that was an unmarried woman having a baby, and there we find that seen as morally acceptable by 67%. So let me just make the point there. If you phrase it, an unmarried woman having a baby, that's seen as modestly more acceptable than if you say having a baby outside of marriage. So there's a very interesting point to you, showing that how you phrase things, as we know in polling, can make a difference. Again, the full trends and examination of how Americans react to all 19 of these moral issues is here at Gallup.com. I think you'll find it interesting to look at it in more detail. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.